All right, welcome back everyone to the Know Your Game podcast. As most of you already know, today's guest will be Mark Dvorak, co-founder, COO of Base Sports Group. Mark, did I get the last name correct?
You did. That was perfect. Perfect. And I'm excited to be on here today. So thank you.
And thank you for taking some time to be here as well. Now, today we have a very interesting topic, as we usually do. We're going to be talking about partnerships versus advertising. So with Mark here, he'll be sharing some of his expertise on the topic, and we'll go as deeply as we can. We'll have some free flow discussion, and at the very end, we're going to try to squeeze in as many tips and suggestions as possible. So to get things going, Mark, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, experience, and how did Base come about?
Perfect. No, and I think that's a great starting point. So again, I'll kind of start from the beginning, right? Grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, made my way to West Virginia University, and then worked in a lot of different roles. Really started my career professionally working with the Cleveland Indians, now Guardians, as well as the Cleveland Browns in stadium and facility operations. Then moved down to North Carolina and worked for a national governing body. So USA Baseball down in Cary, North Carolina, was with them for about 5-6 years, or 4 or 5 years, and then worked for a company called Prep Baseball Report, who in the baseball space is really one of the larger event specific baseball operators in the space. And really my role with Prep Baseball Report was to kind of help build out this tournament branch of our organization. And what we did as we were looking to expand on our reach and our growth of tournaments, we were looking at different facilities within the space where we can operate these events, right? I think there's a couple different ways that you can go. You can look at scattering events all over the country, or you can look at, really taking control from a management and operations standpoint of different facilities. And that was really kind of one of the main routes that we were going. And with that, it's kind of a great transition into how Base really was born, because we were managing and operating some of the larger, and again, this is baseball specific, sports venues in the country. I think we had 4 or 5 venues at the time that we were managing and operating, and we were getting tons and tons of people through the gates, right? Just like any youth and amateur sports facility, the age-old question is, wow, we are getting hundreds of thousands, in some cases even millions of people through our gates annually, but how do we capture that from a sponsorship or advertising or partnership perspective, right? And in my role, and a lot of my coworkers' roles, we were in charge of bringing as many people as we could into the facility, and we were capturing the typical revenue streams from ticketing or concessions or rentals or whatever that may be. But when it came to sponsorships or advertising, I tell people all the time, if Burger King came to our gates and said, hey, we want to sponsor and put a big sign on your outfield fence, I didn't know if that was worth $50 or if that was worth $40,000, right? Like it was something from a knowledge standpoint, but also a bandwidth standpoint to be able to really secure some of those partnerships. But again, I think everybody in the space understands the value of the people coming through these youth and amateur facilities. And it was something where I said, hey, this is an opportunity and something that I think could really benefit everybody as a whole. So we created Base Sports Group, almost act as that third-party agency to help connect brands or bigger companies who are trying to interact with the individuals that are coming through these facilities.
Awesome. And to that, many people use the terms advertising and sponsorship, basically interchangeably. But I believe, according to you, they have a distinct difference. Could you kind of go through and maybe unpack those terms, advertising versus sponsorship, and what are those distinctions?
And I think there is a big distinction between those two, right? We use the term partnerships and sponsorships interchangeably, but when you look at advertising, right, in traditional advertising sense, that's a sign on the wall, right? That is when you're scrolling through, some of your social media platforms, that's something that kind of pops up in front of you, but really there's no interactions there. At Base Sports Group and all the partners that we deal with, we look at these more as sponsorships or different partnerships, right? So I would say it's really changing in the minds of brands a little bit. Not many brands really just want to have advertising where they're just throwing their logo here and there, because they're just really not getting an actual return, or really are able to understand the study or the metrics behind what their return is at these specific venues, right? At all of our venues, we know, hey, X amount of people are going to walk past your sign daily, right? Or annually or monthly or quarterly, whatever that looks like. But what is that really worth? And that's just a typical advertising where we look at things as far as, hey, if we're going to have a sign on our fence here or a sign within our venue, we also want to create these other partnership opportunities where their staff is coming in, actually able to interact with some of the consumers and really kind of see what this space and where the value comes from, versus just, hey, you can hang a sign on my fence or on our wall or on our backboards or wherever that may be, and this is what it is.
Yep, and that makes a ton of sense. I mean, everything is becoming more advanced today, sophisticated, and something that's always existed is ROI. When you talk to the top execs of or owners of a business, that's almost only thing they care about is ROI. So when it comes to what you were just describing, it sounds like tracking ROI can be a bit nebulous at times or difficult to do. So in that space of advertising and sponsorships, how does a business effectively track the success of ROI with these partnerships they're making?
That's a great question, and I'll kind of take a step back really quick as far as like how Base was created. So I had the background on the facility operations, the event operations side, right? My business partner, Carrie, her background is more in the data and analytics and side to be able to help drive some of these ROI numbers. She was working in consulting for some of the largest leagues, the NFL, the NBA, FIFA, you kind of name it, as far as like evaluating these types of partnerships in the space. And really, we bringing really her knowledge into this youth and amateur space, because I do believe that there have been times where larger brands have dipped their toes, if you will, in the water of partnering with some of these youth facilities, but there really hadn't been a way of, again, tracking outside of, hey, this tweet got so many retweets and so many views, and this, we know we have this many people coming through our facility, right? Like outside of some of those basic metrics, really nothing was being given back to the brands as far as, hey, what is the brand awareness of this, right? Like how are people feeling about our brand? We've done a lot of studies in the space that show, and the numbers are incredible, about the way people view brands that are actually supporting the sports where their children and the parents are actually participating, right? Compared to spending money in the collegiate space, compared to spending money in the professional space. There's actual like a brand awareness and a brand affinity associated with that. But really in the past, that nobody's really done that research, right? I think everybody, including myself, who lived in this space for a long time, is like, hey, we have all these people here and they would love to interact with somebody. They would like, it's a perfect demographic. But until, I feel like we were able to prove some of that with some pretty interesting case studies recently, it's not something that was really evaluated, right? And as brands, you kind of mentioned early on in your question, as brands get more sophisticated as far as trying to track what is valuable, right? I mean, the dollar is valuable. When we run these facilities, right? Like we know what our budgets are. When brands are trying to grow, they have budgets as well, and they're going to double down in the areas that they're having success. So how do we in this youth and amateur sports space be able to give those brands the ammunition to say, hey, this actually really is valuable. Let's, get them to double down in the space, which I think is only going to really benefit everybody.
Sure. And I don't know if I'm stepping beyond my scope here, but talk about some success stories. Are there any case studies or recent examples that you can think of where a strategic partnership, had a significant positive impact on a brand or an organization?
Right, right. Well, I think I'll give a couple examples, right? One of them is probably one of our largest partners to date. And I'll go into the name. It's a company called Prime Hydration. It's one of the fastest growing, I guess you would call it a sporting drink or an isotonic drink in the entire nation, right? They kind of came to us early on, and they're having successes for, I'm sure, a bunch of different reasons, right? But they came to us early on and said, hey, here's our targeted demographic. How do we get, and their thing was liquid to lips. How do we get our drink in front of as many parents and as many kids as possible? And we were like, ding, 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 right? Like we have venues and partners that we work with across the country that are foot trafficking hundreds of thousands of people, right? And they've really seen, and we have the reporting to show against it, right? Like the way that people are viewing their brand now because of the way that they're supporting these young athletes. I mean, it really is something that's incredible. Another great example is a facility, a smaller facility in New York, where we partnered with a local hospital, right? Where, anytime we have trainers at the site or anytime, hopefully there's never any, but anytime there's some type of medical emergency, right? Like we have a direct emergency action plan in play where the hospital is even able to come out. They've trained the staff on, some CPR, on just really some basic things that every single facility operator should be aware of. And then there's some other ancillary benefits as far as like some language and different ways to stretch on their walking trails that they kind of have throughout the complex. But really just a pretty interesting partnership that kind of ties, this hospital who is supporting the community versus this actual venue who, right, is a perfect demographic for that hospital to connect with. And then I'll go into one more, which I can't go into too many details right now because we're kind of putting some final touches on it, but we're working locally with a paint company with one of our partners, right? Everybody knows in our facilities, we have to paint courts, we have to paint parking lines, sometimes fields, right? And obviously all the walls, within the venue. So there's a local paint company that we're working with that is willing to create a partnership for all of the members of the community. But also we're doing some pretty cool stuff with some local artists to have some pretty cool murals across the actual venue, just to kind of tie in that local feel that it's really just it's just a great partnership that works all around for everybody.
I love it. And the engagement is layered. You get artists to come in to use the paint at the
Yeah,
facility. So, man, that's awesome. That's a very creative way to enhance that partnership.
completely agree, right? And it's a local company dealing with a local facility, and the whole story behind it is just really going to be awesome. And then at the end of the day, right, they're sponsoring the facility, and they're partnering with they're partnering with the facility, and they're also getting the contract, right? Like any future paint needs for that facility, there's going to be a direct line to this local group, which again, from a true partnership standpoint, I think is really important.
Absolutely. A win-win, if you will.
Yeah.
So with all the good stuff being talked about now, obviously we have to kind of flip the script a little bit and talk about some common challenges for people who are looking to get into or enhance certain partnerships. In your experience, what are some of these, or what are some common challenges, pitfalls that businesses should be aware of when entering into these partnerships?
Right. And that's another great question. I think there's a couple different ways to look at the challenges, right? I think the main challenge that a lot of people deal with is kind of why Bay Sports Group was created, right? It's when we're operating these facilities, it can become a bandwidth issue, right? But also it really there's a knowledge issue, and being able to understand how to, at least we believe at Bay Sports Group, to really kind of value the assets that you actually have to sell appropriately, I think will make a big difference in the long-term return of those partnerships. Unfortunately, what we have seen with a few of the groups that we work with, right, they get this awesome naming rights opportunity with some local group, right? It's a 5-year deal, it's a 10-year deal, but right, like maybe it was valued too high, And then when that term is kind of coming up and we're looking at renewals and you have 4 or 5 years of this, this pretty high number on your balance sheet. And when that brand comes back at the end of that term and says, hey, what did we get out of this? Right? Like, why are we paying it? I think one of the biggest challenges for venues right now is to be able to show that value, and to be able to show that it's true. So I think a couple things when looking at pitfalls are, one, you need to be honest with yourself, right? I think we all believe that we have the greatest and the biggest and facility in the world, but just being honest, right? Like, hey, what are some actual values of the assets that we have? Like when we get in a partnership with a brand, right? You talked about win-wins, like, right, we really focus on renewals and long-term partnerships because we just feel like that's going to be the best for this space. Brands that kind of come in, dip their toes in a little bit and have a bad experience, right? Like that kind of ruins it for everybody, right? If that brand has a great experience and we can kind of share that story from region to region, state to state, facility to facility, it's only going to mean, more good stories and more people diving into that space. So I think, one of the main challenges is understanding what your value is, right? What your assets are available. And then again, just to kind of go back to the previous question is really have an understanding from yourself and your staff of true partnerships, right? I think a lot of people, hey, I'll give you X amount of dollars for this sponsorship, right? I think a lot of people look at it as advertising and they print the sign and they hang up the sign and then, right, like they never deal with that brand ever again. But if you have, and this, I mean, as crazy as it sounds, but if you have a deal with Nike, right, like your staff should be wearing Nike, right? Like you just never know when one of those individuals is, but like that's a commitment from the team, right? Like that might be, hey, on the onset of the partnership, we have to buy, Nike polos for our entire staff or Nike shirts for our entire staff. But I think that's something that, we really reiterate and try to drive home with our different partners that we have is these are partners, right? Like if you were partnered with Nike, you would expect that the same in return for them. So treating them as such and taking the extra time and the extra effort to show that, I think is something that is pretty important in the space.
Sure.
But
And
it
this
can be
might
a
be,
challenge.
yeah, and this might be a silly question, but when it comes to brands, have you ever experienced like a facility having multiple competing brands being partnered with or advertised throughout, like Nike and Reebok or Under Armour and whatever? Does that ever
Yeah,
happen?
and you can do that. You can do that for sure. Specifically, and I think what we're really changing the mindset of, especially with some of our partners, and a really good example of that is probably in the hydration category, right? Like I just kind of mentioned one of our partners, Prime, but a lot of facilities, right, like they have deals with Coke or Pepsi, right? And something that I don't think a lot of people realize is that you can really, pull out different categories within those agreements. Um, I, and again, I don't blame anybody for signing these deals. I probably would have done the same thing when I was I think I probably did when managing some of these facilities because you see, hey, Coke or Pepsi wants this agreement, boom. But obviously, those big brands are pretty smart, right? There's language in there that basically gives them exclusivity on any single category, moving forward. So I mean, the devil is in the details a little bit, but there's different categories you can pull out from like an isotonic drink standpoint, right? Like waters or even like coffee and tea are like other categories that you can pull out of there. So if Coke, right, and Coke is connected with Powerade, if they have a pouring rights deal, you can still pull out the Powerade side so that, hey, maybe we want to have Gatorade throughout our facility, or maybe we want to have right? Like Prime or somebody else. But it's important to have those conversations early on and just kind of be transparent with the brands as far as what it looks like. And if
Sure.
somebody does want exclusivity, then right there's a cost associated with that.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to say there has to be some sort of, negotiating factor where it's like, okay, we'll give you that exclusivity if you want, but we're going to expect a little more in return.
Definitely. And the same with hospitals, right? Like every hospital, looks at some of these opportunities a little differently. Right? Like some have PT, some don't have PT, some, right? Like, and then the different medical categories from like optometry to dentistry to orthodontist, right? Like they're all a little different. So very similar from an overall category standpoint. But there's ways strategically that you can separate those out to maximize some of those partnerships.
Sure. And once, let's say, a strategic, effective partnership is in place, and you have a 3-5 year deal with them. And I know we kind of touched upon it earlier, but they're beyond just saying, okay, here's the ROI, here are the analytics, here's how effective the campaign has gone. Are there other levels of engagement a facility can do with the brand to help nurture or strengthen these partnerships so that when renewal does come around, the brand will say, hey, no brainer beyond the ROI. It was just awesome to deal with these people. And I know that happens. And if so, how do we make that happen more often?
Definitely. So the short answer is yes. Obviously, yes. Again, this goes back to the partnership versus advertising, kind of where everything is at its core. We have an example with one of the facilities that we work with right now. They're doing a breast cancer awareness month, like where they're raising money, right? They're selling T-shirts that they'll have, et cetera, et cetera. And when they started looking at, hey, where should we donate these funds, right? They were looking kind of locally at like different groups, and then right, like we kind of came in and said, well, hey, how about some of your like partners, right? Like so they were partnered with a hospital in the area, or so just kind of looking at some of those different partners and saying, hey, if we're going to raise this money, let's kind of work with our local partners to kind of create these feel good stories where they could, everybody kind of like benefits, and it's a great thing for the entire community and all of your partners that you're building. Something that we do very specifically and we require from all of our partners is to put surveys into market. And those can be coordinated whether they're annually or quarterly to really kind of show some of that brand's affinity, right? Again, when we talk about some of these longer deals, unfortunately or fortunately, whoever signed those deals is probably from both sides of the table is probably no longer at the table, right? The CMO at whatever brand local that we're dealing with has taken another job, right? And so when that next person comes in the line and they say, hey, what is this partnership? We can have year over year surveys as far as, hey, here's what the partnership looks like. Here are some examples of where we work together, right? Whether it was a local blood drive or we had this fundraiser, or we're actually heading out next month as well to one of our partners because we're just having a local partners like happy hour, right? To kind of bring some of our partners in and just say, hey, you're a partner of ours. Like we'd like to recognize that. Some of our partners do open gyms, right, for their company parties, saying, hey, you have the space available to you. It's not during a high traffic time for us, so why don't you bring your staff in and kind of enjoy a couple hours like for like team building, right? We do discounted corporate rates for some of the gyms and that we work with. So just kind of having some of those additional layers where people are actually cognizant of, well, hey, yes, we're sponsoring them X amount of dollars, but also, hey, all of our members and all of our workers can, have a discounted rate, or we know that we have a bunch of little kids here, and every year we can host a kickball tournament or whatever that is. So just kind of getting, looking at those different ways to be true partners kind of helps the long-term value of the way people look at those.
Sure, makes a ton of sense. And I guess this will be my last major question is evolution. In the years that you've been doing this, obviously things have changed, progressed. When it comes to things like, changing consumer behaviors, emerging technologies, do any of those factors influence this space? And if so, how has it done so? And what do you foresee in the next 3 or 5 years in the industry?
I think it's definitely a major factor in kind of taking a look at this space, and personally, and I think the youth and amateur sports space should be excited for this opportunity, right? Like I think Facebook for a while kind of had their ads, and then right with Apple coming in and kind of controlling some of the cookies, and You also read a lot of the reports on scrolling fatigue, right? Like I think the youth and amateur sports space is in a prime position to be able to capitalize on a lot of this, right? I think right, the numbers don't lie from the way parents look at their kids and the way that parents spend on their kids. And as a recent father, I can see that, right? So I really think it's a great opportunity for these youth and amateur sports venues to be able to continue to tell their story of, hey, we have this demographic and they're here for a long time, right? Kids are getting sick of scrolling on their phones. They're scrolling past ads, right? Like Facebook is limiting, the amount of ads and the way people can do it. So why not actually engage with these individuals and with these families where they're spending a majority of their time, right? And that's in, whether it's these massive, tournament venues or whether it's these local indoor facilities where parents and kids are, one, they're spending a lot of time, but they also have a deep affinity to, because of the coaches that are there, because of their teammates that are there, and because of their relationships that are there. So as we continue to build the story to connect all of those things to the brand awareness and the brand affinity and the brand ROI, we actually call it ROO because we're looking at brands return on objectives. Sometimes it can be really hard to show an ROI from like a dollar standpoint, but just making sure that those brands are receiving and have a positive return on their objectives, then I think I think everybody has a really good opportunity to win in this space.
All right. And Mark, to kind of wrap things up, what would you say are some key tips? Obviously, our facility operators and owners, they do advertise, they get into deals and partnerships. But if they wanted to level up their game, maybe they've hit a plateau and they're like, I do see some return on this, but I'm not seeing the kind of return I was hoping for. What would you say to those who are just getting into the market or those who want to elevate?
Right. And outside of what we've kind of just gone through, right? Like view them as partnerships, not as advertising. Have a fair and understanding of what your value is and what your value is to a brand. But also don't be right. Like you can invest a little bit for the sponsorship, right? Like the sign that's been up on the wall for a couple of years, right? Like spend the money to freshen it up a little bit, to make it look good. Spend the time to really understand who your consumers are. Again, we do a lot of research reports for our partners to really understand who the consumer is. I think everybody says, well, hey, baseball players like have this background and this is what they're interested in because that's what everybody's been saying for a long time, right? But like your specific consumers, and whether it's Cleveland, Ohio, or Raleigh, North Carolina, or Phoenix, Arizona, right? Everybody's a little different and might not fit into that exact bubble. So really kind of having a better understanding of who your specific client is. That way, when you're going to brands or when you're going to local companies, you can create partnerships that really, it's a good matchmaking, right? As far as understanding what the brand actually wants and who your consumer actually is. So I think spending the time and resources to be able to understand some of those things, I think actually will create some bigger partnerships, but also some longer lasting partnerships because it's matchmaking at that point.
Right. And again, to wrap things up here, when it comes from a facilitator operator standpoint, when they do get into these arrangements with large brands, and you kind of mentioned this at the beginning, a lot of times they don't even know or understand how much they should be getting in terms of, revenue from that. And that's where you guys can come in, kind of give that consultation and say, hey, this is what you should expect. This is what you deserve in that sort of relationship and everything like that. So in closing, Mark, could you tell everyone who's the best person to reach out to at Base? How would they get in touch with you, and what would be the next best first steps to do?
Well, for sure. So our website is just basesportsgroup.com, BASE sportsgroup.com. On our website, you should be able to find a quick way to kind of get in contact with us. Obviously, if you can figure out how to say my last name and spell my last name, you can look me up on LinkedIn or wherever. My email is also just mdvorsnak@basesportsgroup.com. So always happy to educate, always happy to have any conversations. Again, because we really do believe that the more brands that are investing into this space, as they should be, the better it's going to be as a whole for everybody. So we're happy to help individual facilities or events tell their stories, better understand their consumers, and really just try to help continue to increase some of those revenue streams that can be important in our yearly budgets that everybody's looking at.
Absolutely. Well, Mark, thanks again. Super informative. There were, and leading up to this podcast, this is for the audience, we were kind of going through what kind of questions we should ask. And some of the questions on their own could be their own podcast. So Mark, if you're willing and able, we might have you back again, maybe explore some of those other topics a bit more deeply. But big thanks, everyone. Of course, I put the website on the screen. We hope you got a big takeaway from this. Reach out to Mark, of course, to extend or carry on this conversation. We look forward to seeing everyone on our next podcast. Till then, take care.
Thanks, James.